we're still trying to explore this idea of what international solidarity is, you know, because we've done stuff like like solidarity statements with Venezuela or Palestine, whatnot. But to some degree, we're left to with the question of like, what is the impact of this international solidarity work, right?
Welcome to Red Star Over Asia, the podcast covering politics over the region of Asia from a communist socialist perspective. I'm Bori, one of the co-hosts for today, alongside Mike.
Hello.
Jay.
Hi.
And Jack.
How's it going, comrades?
We also have with us today Nokdu.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with Nokdu. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I was part of the U.S. social movement ever since college. So that's about maybe 2002 or so. Like I did some campus activism and organizing. And then in 2003, when the invasion of Iraq was happening, and there was when Bush declared the Axis of Evil framework that included also North Korea. That's when a lot of Korean Americans in the Bay Area decided to get together and start organizing for peace and reunification. And that's kind of like when I got started and when I got interested in peace and reunification issues in Korea. After organizing in the Bay Area and organizing in Los Angeles, I finally came to Korea because I was very interested in what were the social movements that are happening here, because Korea has some very vibrant social movements. It has a very vibrant workers movement, farmers movement, student movement. It had a very powerful democratization movement. And a lot of those things were what interested me to come to Korea and explore those things like head on. The idea was to just stay here a year or 2 years. And now it's been over 10 years. So yeah, I've been here for quite a while.
That's great insight on your personal history into getting interested into Korea. But do you have any other personal relationships with Korea itself, or was it some sort of curiosity passing behind? Let's have the audience gain more something more of where you're coming from. Yeah.
Sure. It's I think what kind of started early on as like identity politics, in particular, taking classes in college and learning about the history of people of color and whatnot, and that kind of starting off from identity politics and anger and whatnot, and then moving on to a context beyond the United States, towards being against U.S. Imperialism, by also connecting with the histories of third world liberation movements and movements abroad. That kind of got me. I guess it pushed me more towards the left. It made me more interested in struggles, not just against racism, but also against U.S. imperialism, broader international struggles. And I think that just naturally drove me towards being a Korean American. That drove me more naturally towards Korea, the Korean Peninsula. So I guess that's my personal connection, right? Of course, I'm drawn to struggles that are happening all around the world. The Palestinian people's struggles, like Venezuela, whatnot. But in some ways, I guess I thought, given my cultural background, that it made the most sense to contribute to the struggle for a better world through work with Korea. right? Especially because there was a very dynamic movement that people in the United States could definitely learn a lot from.
Okay, Nokdu, that's a pretty interesting personal background. So you eventually end up coming to South Korea. Can you talk more about what motivated the move to South Korea? I know you mentioned you're Korean American, so obviously there's some family history there. But what motivated your move here and getting involved with organizing in South Korea?
Well, it would have to start with like Korean Americans in the Bay Area that were fighting for peace and reunification, because the idea being that Iraq was a part of like Bush Jr.'s axis of evil, so and North Korea was as well. So then people were thinking, oh, North Korea is likely to be the next target, right? So in that regard, it would create like nuclear holocaust, right, in the Korean Peninsula if that were to happen. And so there was like a campaign for peace and reunification, and there was education. And I think that's when we kind of like, Korean American progressives that, of course, were in solidarity with struggles, Palestinian struggles, Filipino struggles, whatnot. That's when we first started getting very interested in what is happening in Korea, and I guess that would be the beginning of it. And I think just there is something beyond the cultural connection. There is something that is extraordinary and very powerful about Korea's social movements. So I think inherently there was something about Korea's social movements that drew me to.
Okay, interesting. So you initially got involved with the peace movement in South Korea, and more recently, you've been involved in more broader kind of international solidarity work. Can you talk more about what you've been involved in more recently?
Basically, the organization that I'm a part of, like we've been from about 2013, we've been exploring what does like international solidarity mean during these times. You know, what is the way that we could harness international solidarity to strengthen the movements abroad, but also the movements here in Korea, right? So in the process, we've done like a whole variety of things. We've done like a ton of writing. We have web scenes. We planned international solidarity trips to Venezuela, to Bolivia. We've done study groups on like Korean modern history. We've done work with like last year we did some like work with around like with women's groups. We explored what like community organizing looks like around the world. So we've done a whole variety of things, and I think in some regards we're still trying to explore this idea of what international solidarity is. Because we've done stuff like solidarity statements with Venezuela or Palestine, whatnot. But to some degree, we're left with the question of like, what is the impact of this international solidarity work, right? Which ultimately connects to having like real power to be able to wield for international solidarity, right? So, yeah, I mean, I guess in many ways, it's been a long journey of trying to figure out how to conduct international solidarity in a way that materially benefits countries abroad and movements abroad, and also materially contributes to movements in Korea.
All right, interesting. That actually leads us into one question that we wanted to ask. So, yeah, this question of international solidarity. On the one hand, everyone I think recognizes that's crucial and important, but it often does becomes sort of a very vague kind of abstract principle, and it's hard to actually bring it down to the ground and make it material and concrete. Venezuela is a good example. Like you, I got very interested in the Bolivarian revolutionary process going on in Venezuela. But it's been sort of sad that there's very little materially that movements in the US, for example, have been able to do to act in solidarity and defend Venezuela against sanctions and other interventions. So, yeah, I was curious your thoughts about how we can, recognize the moral, ethical dimension of international solidarity as a principle, but how we can get it, build those real robust connections internationally where we can actually support comrades abroad when something like Venezuela is ongoing, or what's been happening to Cuba lately with the tightening of sanctions, anti-war movements, et cetera. So can you talk more specifically about your experience in Venezuela? Because you traveled there quite a bit, I think, right? And Latin America more generally.
Sure. I feel like there are, I guess, to talk about like international solidarity before talking about my experience in Venezuela, I think maybe international solidarity could be divided between like international solidarity activism and international solidarity movements. I don't think there's a shortage. Well, not necessarily a shortage of international solidarity activism. There are people in solidarity with Venezuela all around the world. There are like international solidarity acts. There are pickets. There are all these type of things. But the question is more like, how come this has not like filtered to the masses? How come this has not sparked an imagination or feelings of solidarity among the masses that would turn activism into a movement, right? And I think in some regards, I guess that poses the question of like, what does it mean to do international solidarity and how should it be done? And ultimately, international solidarity it is done, of course, for like moral reasons. But I also think in some ways, the notion of solidarity is not necessarily a moral principle as much as the notion that I can't be free until you're free, until we're all free, right? I think that's kind of like at the heart of solidarity, right? But while we do that is how do we build power in where we are, right? Because that's in some ways the only place where we could build power. How do we build power where we are so that whatever acts of solidarity we have actually have some significance, right? Have power, right? Have power to actually mean something, right? As regards to Venezuela, if we take a look at it, there was like very much a heyday of Venezuela. Like I think maybe 2012, 13, 2000 maybe 10, 11, 12 in Korea, where a lot of people were talking about Venezuela. People were like sending delegations to Venezuela. And in that regard, there was a kind of, it both inspired conversations within Korea, while at the same time giving like support to what was happening in Venezuela. So I guess the point would be, it's a bit of a difficult. I guess I don't have like a clear answer, but it's ultimately about how do we build power locally while also lending that power to movements abroad, right? I think that's international solidarity.
So, Nokdu, you mentioned Venezuela and Latin America, that you've been involved there and have traveled there quite a bit. So when you first went to Venezuela with these delegations, what were the goals and motivations for these delegations? Who was organizing them? So you as a Korean American, for example, living in South Korea, what were these Korean organizations or international organizations you were working with? What were they hoping to get out of going to Venezuela? What were they hoping to offer? by traveling to Venezuela in terms of solidarity. Can you just talk a little more specifically about what you did there?
Well, we visited like various aspects of the Bolivarian revolutionary process, and the purpose of going to Venezuela was to let other people know, through the process, let other people know about what is happening in Venezuela, but also to by basically saying, hey, look, they're doing this in Venezuela. This is possible. They're trying to create a better world, and we should do the same in Korea, right? So it was a way of political exposure, right? A political exposure in order to organize people. So we've had like several like visits to Venezuela. Uh, I was part of like the first kind of like exploratory one. We did various things. We met with like man, it's been such a long time ago. It was like I think maybe 2011 or 2010 when I first went there. Um, it was, I guess, the biggest impressions that I got when I was there was just this kind of like exuberance for democracy, and this notion that people felt like democracy actually mattered, where who you voted for mattered, and you were excited to participate and you were excited to be part of a process. Uh, and in some regards, the reason why we organized, the delegations that followed afterwards, were because we wanted people to feel that and to sense that and to experience it. In contrast to Korea, where things don't feel like that, where people don't feel excited to talk about the Constitution and about politics. Instead, people survive. It's because people's survival doesn't necessarily connect to that. Like who you elect in Korea doesn't necessarily impact very much like your day-to-day life. But in Venezuela, it did. It had a direct impact. And in that regard, you got to see democracy in action, where like the economic sphere in some degree was incorporated into the political sphere, so that people's decisions impacted like their daily lives. And people were excited about it. We visited communal councils. Um, we we went to like the various hospitals and clinics. We got to talk to Cuban doctors that were there. We went to the schools. We went to like the housing that the government was building up in the mountaintops for the poor. We got to witness things like, I mean, one of the most striking things in Venezuela was that there were these, I guess, what do you call it? Like electric cars that kind of like hang and that go up mountains, gondola something. I forget what they're called, but there were these things that were connected to the trains, to the subways, right? And basically, the communes in that neighborhood had decided that they wanted to invest money in creating basically this form of transport, so that old people or disabled people didn't have to walk 30 minutes up a hill, but that they could instead just take these basically like cars up to the top that were connected to the subway. And what was very impressive about that was that oftentimes, like in urban design, the poor are an afterthought. If there's like a bus line or if there is like a subway line, it's not usually the poor. It's just, it happens to benefit the poor, but it's not driven by the needs of the poor, right? But in Venezuela, like you actually saw things being constructed simply for the sake of poor people, right? And that kind of like, it blew our minds, you know. I think in one of the other delegations that followed, somebody talked about how one of the most impressive moments was when they met this man in a communal council who didn't have an arm, who only had one arm, right? He was disabled. And he said, like, before in Venezuela, before Chavez, I was just somebody that had little value, because I was just this guy with one arm, right? I was disabled. But after Chavez, I became like a member of a commune, somebody whose opinions, whose ideas, whose who was a member of this community, and it was important in like constructing this. And in some regards, that tells you a lot about how people were transformed in Venezuela. Everybody talks about this, how like people have like little miniature copies of the Constitution and of various statutes, and like that's kind of like impossible to imagine, I think, in Korea or even in the United States, where how many people actually read the Constitution and care about it and are impressed and proud about it. Like, I'd imagine very, very few, So, yeah. So that was kind of like, I think the biggest thing about Venezuela was being able to breathe in the air and breathe in how people are transformed. And of course, Venezuela is in much more difficult situation now. But nonetheless, Latin America has been completely transformed. And in that regard, like it can't go back, but it's just finding a very difficult time moving forward, right?
So thank you for the talk about your experiences in Venezuela. But wanted to know if you found anything in your experiences in Latin America that the social movements in Korea could make use of. If there is anything that you thought is very applicable in the Korean social movements.
Oh, and I want to also jump on that and add the question of, is there any conscious attempts of building some sort of relationship networks or even solidarity between Venezuela and South Korea currently that you're aware of?
I guess what were some of the lessons that we could get out of it? I mean, in many ways, it's one can't just apply what is happening in Venezuela or what is happening in any other country and just like take it wholesale, right? And I think that's also like what Venezuelans talk about, right? That whatever new social metabolism that they create has to like involve like it has to be based on their reality, right? And that's also the case in Korea. If we were to extract any lessons from Venezuela, it would be the notion of like transforming society by giving power to the people, right? By creating not that there is a difference between somebody decreeing something from above, decreeing even like a reform from above, versus people fighting for reform from below, and in the process being re-energized and becoming more powerful, being empowered, right? But not empowered in this kind of shallow sense of the word where you feel a sense of power, but where you feel a sense of power and you actually have power and you want to actually like fight, right? So I think if I think the lesson that comes from Venezuela is the power that comes when you transform people, right? Even despite all the difficult situation that Venezuela is in, like the people have been transformed, and there is at least 30% of people that are like hardcore Chavista, hardcore people that are committed to this revolutionary process. And I'm not sure if you can say that about anywhere else in the world, right? And in that regard, maybe the biggest thing that happened when Chavez took power and the whole process that unfolded was the transformation of people. Because at the end of the day, that's what remains, right? What remains is people and how people have been transformed through the experience. And I guess in that regard, a lesson to be learned is that to transform society, we have to create reforms, structural reforms that give more and more power to the people, right? So that the people can build on top of that, right? There's a difference between uh, there's what is called like affordable reforms, right? Reforms that we ask because that is what the system is able to afford or willing to give, but of course will take away when it is not affordable anymore, versus reforms that are rooted in people's power, they're driven by people's power, and go beyond what is affordable and create the basis for more power, right? I think perhaps that's the lesson to be gotten out of Venezuela.
So, if you don't mind me trying to reword this so I can understand it better, uh, would it be correct if I understood your answer as saying that the lesson is to recognize the importance of organizing the masses into a political subject with power of its own? That is something that has to be at the center of our movements.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. That's well summarized.
I remember you mentioned how this level of political participation that you see in Venezuela that is like really extraordinary. We don't see that in Korea, but it wasn't that long ago where we had mass political participation in Korea. With the democracy movement and even a brief experiment in direct democracy in Gwangju. And I was curious that when you came back to Korea, was there any discussion of trying to connect it to what was happening in Venezuela to Korea's history?
Oh, sure. That's actually great, Jay. I mean, yeah, you're correct, right? There was a candlelight uprising that happened in Korea, and the candlelight uprising itself, like, transformed Korean people too, right? It didn't necessarily transform Korean people into like revolutionary subjects, but at the least, it like putting like toppling the highest power in a country gave Korean people more of a sense that like justice can be carried out, right? Like it showed people that like, when the boss like yells at you and spits at you or kicks your shin or like humiliates you, that if you record that and if you blow it up on the internet, people will get like pissed, and that eventually that boss will come and bow his head or her head and apologize for the actions that they've done, right? So it did have like something that transformed people, right? There is some latent power that still remains after the candlelight uprising, right? Of course, the problem is that in many ways, like progressives haven't been able to take that power and channel it and harness it uh, into alternatives, right? I mean, part of it has to do with like the breakdown of political progressive parties in Korea, um, their inability to offer like a very strong alternative that could spark and it can inspire people's imagination. The fact that we're stuck in a very, I mean, to some degree, a very like two-party system, although it's a little bit more free than, for example, like the United States, where it's like effectively a two-party dictatorship. But in Korea, it's a little bit more free. But effectively, there was something that happened with the candlelight uprising, and there's something that still lingers in the air. But I guess I think the question that still remains is how do we how do we still harness that? How do we find that? How do we organize that? Uh, yeah, that's like the task that I think the social movement is left with, like post Candlelight Protest, post Candlelight Uprising, right?
That's a great answer. Also want to think. I also think that for us to draw lessons, we don't just look at the positive aspects of it, but also its limits, its contradictions, and therefore the conditions, so that we can see in what context something worked or not. That said, I would say that the people feeling that they had some sway over their own lives was something that happened certainly in the candlelight protests when people went out to the streets. And for a brief extent, there were people talking about how this might effectively change their everyday lives as well. But after Park Geun-hye was taken down, you saw all that channeled into bureaucratic and inter assembly a general assembly politics where just electing someone is sufficient for changing a change, and how all of that energy kind of fizzled out. Uh, but it seems like in Venezuela that was sustained somewhat. But I guess my question would also be, uh, not everyone was happy about that. What were their roles, and what kind of what did they do? What other contradictions were you able to kind of sense in Venezuela? I guess another uh, difference between, if we continue on with this comparison between Korea and Venezuela, would be the class composition of the protests, and maybe these organizations that were able to channel this. In Korea, it would be the KCTU providing the basic infrastructure for the protests and not being recognized because uh, it's the hit. Everyone hits upon the KCTU very casually, even progressive politicians as well. But I guess the case was a bit different in Venezuela. Could you kind of shed light on those aspects uh, if this question made any sense?
But I think before we delve into that question, I think we need to clarify a couple of things for the international audience who may not know much about recent Korean political history. That the Candlelight Uprising refers to the time back in 2016, 2017, when the Korean people were successful in getting rid of a president through nonviolent protests, which was initially and throughout was led by the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the KCTU.
I think a lot of people would contend that the KCTU led it. I think it was explicitly rejected on such terms. And what I was trying to get at was that the KCTU, despite not being recognized as a key player, was still providing the infrastructure for the protest to be able to be sustained for long periods of time in the first place. Because the KCTU itself weren't setting forward demands and stuff like that. They were more in the backseat, providing like stage equipment and organizing, having the organizing networks around the country utilize their resources in support of the protest and stuff like that.
I would say that like the Candlelight Protest, Candlelight Uprising, was a very spontaneous outburst of outrage. I think in many regards, like Park Geun-hye, her popularity had been waning, and she had done various things that antagonized like sector that made sectors of society very discontent. You know, with the families of Sewol victims, There's like various labor issues, all these different things. And when news about like the bizarre situation that arose, like I think people it just something blew up and people were just outraged and people were like, what the, I can't believe this is happening. And I think that's what drove people to the streets. It was a very spontaneous outburst of outrage and anger. I remember seeing a video somewhere where there was like an old man, like in his maybe 60s or 70s, and he was like, I'm gonna like chop off this hand because this hand voted for Park Geun-hye, right? And you're like, whoa, that's pretty intense, like some diehard conservatives or the population of Korea's demographic that is generally very conservative, like coming out and going to the streets and seeing like old people like there too, and you're like, what the, oh my god, like it's like so big, right? So I think there's a very spontaneous element to it, and I guess the point is that an uprising rises and then it surely ebbs, right? And I guess the point is that before it ebbs, like people need to be organized, because once they ebb and once that energy just dissipates back into society, into life as normal, then it becomes very difficult to see. Like you can't just go around and say, hey, did you go to the candlelight protest? Did you go to the candlelight protest? Do you want to do something? It's like it becomes difficult. So it's at that moment where there's an uprising that the organizing has to happen, where people have to be channeled into like different organizations, like different community organizations that I know, like they had like mini candlelight protests like on the weekday, and they had like, to organize, you actually have to meet the person. You have to put a name to the face. You have to get a phone number so that it's not just like a face that you see in the crowd, right? So they would have these kind of like mini candlelight protests, and after the mini candlelight protest, they would say, hey, whoever wants to, let's grab a beer, right? And then that's how you get to know the people that are coming up. And then when that moment subsides, like you still have that phone number, or you still know that person. Like some of the arts collectives that we did, they did like a lot of arts performances, like they did street theater. And as they were doing street theater, they asked people, hey, like, are you an artist? Like, do you want to join us in creating art during this moment? And they got people to join. And as they joined, like, that's what remained after the upsurge, and then when the upsurge ebbed, right? Like people's names and people's phone numbers and that connection. So in many ways, like it was like such a massive national social wide kind of thing that happened, that I guess maybe all that we could have done is catch as many people before the surge like resides, or the surge like comes back down. How many people can we catch in the net, right? I think that was a strategy of a lot of the organizations that were around.
You mean in Venezuela or during the candlelight protest in Korea?
In Korea. Yeah. So Venezuela is different, right? Venezuela is different because Venezuela, like, they took power. And they created the institutions that could actually draw those people out, right? They said, hey, like, if you have in the cities, in the urban areas, they're concentrated. If you have 300 people, you could build a communal council. And if you build a communal council, then you're entitled to these economic resources, right? So when they did that, they gave tools for tools and opportunities for the activists and organizers in those neighborhoods to go around and say, hey, we're going to build like a communal council because we want to replace our aged like pipe system where like hot water takes 10 minutes to come out, right? It's like, we want to do this. And in the process, they created community councils. And in those community councils, they're able to have a certain depoliticization that happens. But that's not the case in Korea, right? Like after the Candlelight Protest, it's not like committees rose up all around the country where they were like, well, how do we keep the spirit of the Candlelight Protest going, right? It kind of like dissipated. And while the energy is still remains in society, it's like unidentifiable to some degree, right?
If I might add, I think one difference that I recognize is that I think the Candlelight Protests was in a sense, if I summarize it in a very almost too simplistic a way, it was a movement to undo. It was a movement that is almost purely reactive against the corruption and all the malpractices of the Park regime. So I think because of that, once the President Park was taken out of power, there was no objective left. Whereas I think in case of the Venezuelan situation, there was more of a proactive kind of element to it. There was a lot of movement to build new things rather than getting rid of a thing that's hurting us. They had a set of objectives that went beyond getting rid of something that's not working. So I think that could be the major difference that could explain why the revolutionary energy continued for longer in Venezuela. Whereas, because in our case, once that objective of getting Park out was achieved, and I think we didn't have an organization that successfully presented a set of objectives that could capture that popular energy at the time.
Sure. I would just say that that's what I think, that classification, that distinction makes sense after the fact, because it was successfully co-opted by liberal elites in Korea, usually called the 586ers, the current administration members of the Moon administration. They're called 586 because they're no longer in their 30s. They used to be called the 386ers, which meant that current 30s who went to the university in the 80s. I forgot what the 6 meant, but so they launched their political careers.
They were born in the 60s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. So they launched their political careers of being radical student activists, but had, in a sense, sold out and were becoming liberal administrators for South Korean capital. So there was a lot of popular energy that were trying to, I guess, change the way that their everyday lives were constituted as, but it was channeled into just the goal of changing administrations. And the failure for the left to do otherwise is what makes the distinction make sense now, that it ended up being a reactive kind of movement. But I don't think it was something like that from the start. There was potential for it to have been otherwise. Otherwise, I agree. I think that's a fair distinction to make. It just complicates things a bit more.
Yeah. So I think it is important for the people in social movements anywhere to always remember that our objectives have to be active. That we just can't think of reacting to whatever bad things that are happening around us. I think only objectives that strive to build new things can capture people's hearts and minds.
That's a very Spinozist thing to say, Jack. We strive for what was it? Positive passions? I don't know the term right now, but we're not going for sad passions. We want to have these passions that build our own capacities to act more actively, not ones that are just reactive.
that was a
Sorry.
like philosophy major's outburst or something.
Philosophy majors in the house.
I'm not technically a philosophy major. That's Mike's specialty, but
An engineering major who only takes philosophy classes.
I don't take philosophy classes either. But that Spinozism had to come out somewhere.
Puri is a poser. Puri's a poser.
Yeah, totally.
So the last level of organization internationally has been pretty weak for decades now. Capital has made supply chains much more global. But aside from some impressive projects by labor unions and the anti-war movement, you have nothing even close to what global capital has built. Even internationalism as a slogan and as an ethos has been de-emphasized. And I'm quite curious, what do you think some of the causes were of this? Like, what are some of the barriers to building real material international solidarity?
I mean, I guess when you look at the moments of the various internationals, right? Like the first international, second international, third international, each of this the movement and organizations the organizations, the political parties that were a part of that had a real material base, right? They actually organized people. There were labor unions, there were political parties with many, many members. And in some regards, they were fighting because they saw a common vision where your struggle connected to my struggle, right? And perhaps, I mean, in some ways, we are at a period of approaching global warming catastrophe, right? And where inequality is very severe and whatnot. And in that regard, it seems like this moment would be ripe for such such a vision, for a plan, for something, for I guess for lack of some sort of zeitgeist or some sort of spirit or something that would in some ways overtake and bring people together and whatnot, right? But that doesn't just happen spontaneously. I think it happens by the very tedious work of organizing people one by one into different organizations and studying and trying to understand what is the current moment right now. So that, I mean, in many ways, if you look at social dynamics, it kind of goes through cycles, right? You might have a very transformative moment. If we look at Korean history, you can see that it has certain cycles, right? There's a period where there's massive transformative potential where people are on the streets and people are making demands for changing society. Then there's a period of a counter movement, right? A counter movement that attacks, where you have to be in the defensive, where you have to try to consolidate the reforms that you're able to push forward, that allow you to defend your movement and that allow you to build more in the future. And perhaps the moment that we are now, which is a third moment where we have to reflect to try to better understand where we are, where we need to go, We need to study. And most importantly, we need to organize people, you know, like, uh, and organizing people is a very concrete thing. It's not like talking in front of 100 people. It's literally organizing one person, and then that person organizing another person, and those 3 people organizing other people. Uh, it's a very concrete thing, building relationships. You know, this is a time when you hold your comrades close. You know, because these are in some ways like difficult times. But I think the point of it is to organize and to study, is to eventually create the material basis for like an upsurge in the social movement, where when when there is both clarity and there is the power to be able to change society. And I feel that we're at the cusp of that. You know, I we are at a cusp where people are explicitly talking about anti-capitalism without rolling their eyes, right? Do they fully understand what that means, or is it like more of a superficial meme? I think, I think it is a shallow understanding, but the fact that people are talking about anti-capitalism and they're using the word capitalism, that actually is like significant.
I'll have to stop you there because when you say we, that's the American context speaking, right? I haven't come across.
Oh, about like anti-capitalism?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, sure, sure. That's true. That is true. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't come across Koreans explicitly talking about anti-capitalism.
Oh, that's very true, actually. Yeah, I mean that's the American side of me talking, I guess. Yeah, but oftentimes American ideas like have repercussions all around the world. You know, like it or not.
Do you see that kind of sorry for disrupting you again, but do you see that taking hold in Korea? Do you see your activities getting uh, better reception?
Good question.
Is there somehow effects of that kind of discourse on socialism, on anti-capitalism, on that there has to be some sort of an alternative uh, getting some hold here?
It's a good question. I don't necessarily think that's what's happening in Korea, but also Korea is a place that in my opinion, is not a place that changes incrementally. It's a place that changes incrementally, but you can't really see the increment. And all of a sudden, it's just there's once something takes hold, it just kind of like burns all across like a prairie fire. Like like I think qualitative shifts happen. It's like the quantitative shifts that happen in society. I think they're like less visible, and I think the qualitative shifts overtake Korean society like all at once. So yes, you're right. Nobody's using words like anti-capitalism in Korea, uh, but they are talking about very problems that, like, yeah, I mean, the Korean economy is not going to get better. The economy nowhere in the world is going to get better, except China, maybe, right? The world is gonna go, the capitalist mode of production is gonna go from stagnation punctuated by crisis to stagnation punctuated by crisis. That's the reality, unless we shift. And I think Korea, to some degree, uh, that's also Korea's reality, right? We are finding ourselves where I don't think people have, while people are not anti capitalist, I don't think young people are hopeful about the future like old people were, like my parents' generation were, right? Where the economy was prospering, where things seem to be in the upswing. I don't think people are are like that, and I think there's something there that needs to be tapped into, and it needs to be fully exploited. This feeling of and I use the word exploited not in a negative sense, but in a very technical sense, which is fully used, right? Fully exhausted, which is this certain kind of. Uh, I think Korean society is not willing to take crap from people anymore. Take crap from higher ups. That was kind of the culture during the dictatorship, where like you just took crap, uh, and people are not. So I think there's a shift, and I think that people there is a certain. I wouldn't use the word disillusionment, but there is a certain kind of like people don't see a solution. I don't think. I mean, Porty, maybe you could talk about this or anybody else, but I don't think people see a solution. I mean, I guess the closest thing to a solution is what? The fourth industrial revolution. But honestly, like how much has that really like lifted up the economy? How much has that transformed anything really?
Yeah, it's mostly speculative.
Yeah, but maybe the promise is still there. I mean, like right now, people, young people, don't have any jobs, and their only real future or hope is like speculation in financial markets.
Well, I kind of want to, that what you just said kind of made me think about why that potential hasn't been fully exploited. I will kind of want to, if it's okay with you, kind of want to go back to the comments you made about the global climate crisis. Because I remember in the last election in Korea, the liberals in the Democratic Party, which is obviously not the same as Democratic Party in America, they're much smarter, has ran on a platform of the Green New Deal. And I've heard this from other leftists in Korea that the liberals have a very long and successful history of co-opting mass movements and leftist viewpoints. And I wonder if you think the liberals are one of the bigger obstacles to fully exploiting that sense of disillusionment and anger. Because I think it's fair to say that the Democratic Party was the one that was the political faction that benefited the most post Candlelight Revolution.
Sure. I mean, I think you're saying like it's the job to it's the first. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, but I think what you're saying is the first thing to do to discredit and deface the Democrats. Um, to do that before we could actually build anything, so that people have no illusion about them. Is that your question, kind of?
I'm not necessarily. I mean, I don't know if the Democratic Party needs to be taken out first or even worked with. But I'm just quite curious as to like when we talk a lot about how Venezuela was able to take advantage of all this mass public participation, whereas in Korea it was the liberals that took the most advantage. And I'm just very curious as to like why that is.
It's a sure. It's a good point. I mean, the reason why in Venezuela, like it was possible for the alternative like Hugo Chavez to rise was because middle class voters voted for him, and the reason why they did was because the liberals and the conservatives for a long time were in cahoots with each other, and it just became very clear, and society just became completely like decayed, and in some ways one can say that maybe they're ahead of the timeline, I guess. Like maybe that's something that could happen in Korea, where people realize that like the Democrats, they're not offering much of an alternative to the conservatives, right? Uh, or the liberals are not offering much of a alternative to conservatives. I guess the question would be, I think I don't necessarily think the point is to delegitimize, to waste our time like focusing on delegitimize, but I think our point would be to focus on creating progressive alternatives and building power behind that, and in the process discrediting and delegitimizing. But at this point, like progressives don't have that much pull in Korean society, you know. Progressive parties don't have like what 6%, you know. So in some ways, people are at a loss. But I guess the solution is for progressive parties to build, to organize, and when they have power, to topple the liberals. Then that's when you do it. But this is not the time to like topple the liberals. This is the time when we build like our build our basis, you know, where we find alternatives, where we find policies that give more power to the people, that plant the seeds for change, while at the same time addressing like people's concerns that mobilize them and that make them care, right? So I guess the answer to that would be yes. There is a certain kind of illusion towards the liberals that people have because of like what Podi said about the 586 generation, right, and the historical role that they did in bringing like representative democracy to Korea. But at the same time, like our energy should be spent on creating, you know, I think like most Korean people say, oh, you know, the progressives, they're good people, but I don't think they can rule, right? That's kind of like why people don't really vote, right? But in some ways, I guess it's to show, it's to build. Yeah. I guess I would say to build and to organize, person one by one, and to explore. And international solidarity has to role because we can learn from what is happening in Venezuela, what is happening in Europe, what is happening in the US, what is happening in different countries.
On that point of organizing, I also have another question, which is what other infrastructures have you seen being built, you know, across nations to build solidarity? Like I remember when I lived in Gwangju, I used to go to a migrant church, and I remember the vice bishop there mentioned the deaths of the farmer under Park Geun-hye's administration. I believe his name was Park Nam-gi, and you know, I thought that was a very interesting moment that, well, especially as an American, I see a Catholic priest talk in a very politicized manner, you know, towards working class folk. And it also made me think about how I know La Via Campesina has done a lot towards Venezuela solidarity. And I was curious, is there any infrastructure being built there among the Korean Peasants League or other organizations on building that international movement?
I think that international solidarity acts do happen in an institutional level. I mean, the KCTU has done that. Right? The KCTU like brings delegations. It's in solidarity with like struggles happening in other countries, like that, like the peasants and stuff. That's also happening, right? But I think it just comes back again to the question of like, it's happening in a very small scale, and it's not necessarily overtaking the masses. It's not become like the spirit of the time, right? And I think that's the more important question. It's not the question of whether it's happening, because it is happening, but it's like, why is it not overtaking the masses? You know, why is it not giving it that kind of like very strong push and very strong power that could transform Korean society and transform those other countries that were like in solidarity with?
Nokdu, you had mentioned this, or I guess a couple of you had mentioned this problem of, to use two examples, the Democratic Party in the US and Minju, the main liberal party in South Korea, that when we have these upsurges like the Candlelight Vigil, or in the case of the US, there's the anti-war movement, or I guess the civil rights movement more historically. There is this like process by which these dominant liberal forces can kind of metabolize, co-opt, and demobilize social movements in some ways. And that's a really hard thing to resist because it ends up like limiting people's imagination of what's possible. I mean, you mentioned before, Nokdu, that one of the things about Venezuela is people broke through that and could start imagining things in a really radical, revolutionary way. Our local reading group has been reading this little book lately by Mark Fisher called Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? And there's a quote in there he mentions, I think it's from Zizek, that a lot of people think, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which I think is true in a lot of contexts. But, in Venezuela, and then I think moments like the Candlelight movement, people do break through that. It's almost like breaking out of the matrix and being able to imagine life outside of it. And I think figuring out how to foster that seems to be key in moving beyond sort of these waves of protest that just sort of, undergo their own process of entropy and fizzle out. And we're trying to catch the cadre that come out of it and prepare the infrastructure for the next time there's an upsurge. But I don't know. It's hard to get people to imagine things in a revolutionary way because, one thing about neoliberalism, we talked about the difficulty of building real international solidarity. One thing that neoliberalism does is it not only reorganizes the economy and, was a different strategy for capital, it also atomizes people in their own communities, right? Historically, in a lot of places, you would have entire communities that were centered around a workplace, an industrial workplace, for example. And now the nature of work and the nature of our lives, it's a lot more deracinated and atomized. So it makes it a lot more difficult to organize. But on the other hand, we do have these new technologies, but I don't know. It's a difficult question, how to foster political imagination.
I mean, I think that society does. I believe that it does go it's like cyclical, and I believe that there will surely be an upsurge again. That it's almost inevitable, right? I think the question is will we be ready when that upsurge happens, and will we have enough people organized so that we can direct such an upsurge, right? Where we do control, and where we have built relationships with community groups and all these things, where there is an infrastructure that could harness that energy when that energy comes, because that will happen. Like the people, when they're repressed, when life gets hard, it's just natural that they will rise up. Or it's just like when that moment happens, is there an infrastructure in place that could turn an uprising into a revolutionary moment, into a transformative moment, right? And I think that depends about what we do at this moment, right? What we do when it is not that moment. And what we do is we organize people one by one, and we study, and we sharpen our ideology and our understanding of the world, and we build connections. We strengthen the infrastructure of the social movement while building up our organizations, not just by recycling each other, right? But by actually going out and talking to people
Right.
that have never been politicized before. And organizing those people.
That's a nice wrap up.
Sound advice.
Yeah, sound advice to the to the talk we had today. We're getting to the point of 90 minutes, and I think that's a bit too long for the podcast we're thinking of. So I think we can wrap it up here for today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences and thoughts on Venezuela and international solidarity in general, Nokdu.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Nokdu.
I would like to add that you will not be prepared for that next upsurge if you're not there. So, dear listeners, please stay healthy and stay alive and don't get arrested.
And also, if any of you out there listening has any interest in reaching out to us, where should they do so?
Unless sharing it would get you arrested, then don't share
Well,
it.
yes.
Don't get arrested. Yeah. Just send smoke signals into the air.
And if you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends and comrades who may be interested. And also subscribe to Red Star Over Asia on Apple, Spotify, or your preferred platform. And leave us a good review if you did like the show. We are also on Twitter at Red Star Over Asia and on Facebook as well. We would love to hear from you with feedback or suggestions for future guests or topics. So please do drop us a line at redstaroverasia@gmail.com. Until next time, bye-bye.